Good morning. Good morning and welcome as we come together to mark World Interfaith Harmony Week this week at Concordia College. The proposal for a World Interfaith Harmony Week came to the United Nations General Assembly in fall of 2010 by King Abdullah II of Jordan and was adopted unanimously by the Assembly. Based on shared values and convictions of love of God and love of the neighbor, or love of the good and love of the neighbor, the resolution calls for shared religious and non-religious expressions during this week, while it affirms the importance of mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue as important dimensions of a culture of peace. Concordia first marked World Interfaith Harmony Week 2 years ago, and so when Julia Brooklocker and Jake Bordelon asked us last fall if we would partner in it again this year, we were pleased to say yes and to work with them in the months leading up to this week. We are pleased to mark this week in partnership with Better Together and with the Forum on Faith and Life. We are excited for the week to come and to welcome 4 different speakers from 4 different faith and non-faith traditions who will reflect on World Interfaith Harmony Week. We welcome Concordia's own professor, Dr. Ahmed Afzaal, this morning, speaking from his tradition of Islam. We look forward to Richard Henderson, a member of the board of directors of the Center for Interfaith Projects, speaking from his tradition of Baha'i tomorrow. On Wednesday, we welcome Kim Anderson, a professor of early childhood and education at the White Earth Tribal Community College in Mahnomen, Minnesota, speaking from her tradition of Native American spirituality. And on Thursday, we welcome interfaith scholar Robin Adams, speaking from her interfaith experience at Concordia, coming out of her background of atheism. And so we welcome you to come back each day this week. This morning especially, we thank Dr. Ahmed Afzaal for his reflection and Concordia's senior Abdallah Shuhada for his recitation from the Quran.
Hello everybody, my name is Abdallah. I'm going to read Surah 59, chapter 59, verses 18 to 24. I'll be reading it in Arabic, but it's translated in your book, so أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة أصحاب النار هم الفائزون أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم صدق الله العظيم. This is just a small recitation of the Quran, and one thing I'd like to point out is the poetics of Quran. The way it was read, if you guys have noticed, at the end of each sentence, it really almost matched. So Al-Aziz al-Hakim, al-Jabbar, al-Mutakabbir. So these are all names of God that were mentioned, and yeah, they were recited in Arabic. So, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Abdullah, for your recitation. So, interfaith harmony is an important topic, and there's a great deal that can be said about it from an Islamic viewpoint. I decided to do something different. I decided that instead of tackling this topic head on, I'm going to approach it indirectly in a roundabout way, sort of, by focusing on the concept of harmony itself. In doing so, my aim is to enlarge and enrich our understanding of this particular concept with the help of some of the resources that are available to us in the Islamic tradition. Using these resources, I will try to clarify some of the theological meanings and ethical implications of the concept of harmony. And once I have completed that task, I will try to relate our new and hopefully enlarged and enriched understanding to the topic of interfaith harmony. But first, some background. When I use the phrase Islamic tradition, I mean the combined legacy of some 1400 years of intellectual output by Muslim scholars and sages, jurists, and theologians, philosophers, and mystics. In this sense, the Islamic tradition is vast and rich and complex and multifaceted and incredibly diverse. The Islamic tradition, like any other intellectual tradition, does not speak with one voice. It speaks with many, many different voices. What unites all this diversity and richness is the fact that in one way or another, virtually all of it is informed by and often centered upon the Quran. The Quranic discourse is thoroughly soaked in God. It is theocentric in the extreme. If you open a copy of the Quran at random and start reading, you won't be able to go very far. You won't be able to go more than a few lines without encountering some mention of God in some form. Muslims, of course, believe that the Quran is the word or speech of God. But any thoughtful reader of the Quran can discern that the Quran is also about God to a large extent. And that is why reading, reciting, or listening to the Quran evokes a powerful sense of God's presence. The Quran has a lot to say about God, who God is, what God is like, how does God relate to people, how are people supposed to act in relation to God, and so on. The first half of the Islamic testimony of faith states that there is no deity except God. God is one, but God has innumerable attributes. Some of these attributes are mentioned in the Quran in the form of names, divine names. For example, compassion is one of the divine attributes, while the compassionate is a corresponding divine name. Thus, God is the merciful, the all-knowing, the almighty, the sovereign, the holy. God is the creator, the maker, the fashioner, the gentle, the exalted, and so on. These are called the most beautiful names. Because of the theocentric nature of the Quranic discourse, when the Quran refers to creation and created beings, it often does so in terms of signs. A sign is something that points towards something else. In the Quranic discourse, everything other than God is a sign of God. And all signs are signs of God. All things are signs, and all signs are signs of God, because all things point towards God. According to the traditional Islamic worldview, all things point towards God because everything in creation is understood to be a reflection or a manifestation of a unique configuration of God's own names and attributes. For this reason, the phenomena of the world do not make any sense when approached on their own. They make sense only when they are interpreted as signs of God. The significance of a thing lies primarily in its capacity to act as a sign, that is to say, its capacity to signify God. Therefore, the traditional Islamic approach to any issue or question is to begin by considering the relevant names and attributes of God, and then inquiring into the ways in which those names and attributes are reflected or manifested in particular phenomena. The flow of meaning is therefore top-down, not bottom-up. Now, with this background in mind, let's reflect on the concept of harmony. The word means simply a pleasant arrangement of musical notes. By extension, it refers to a state of peace and equilibrium among different or dissimilar things. One way of illuminating the meaning of a concept is to consider its opposite. The opposite of harmony is disharmony, and by extension, conflict, discord, strife. How might the Islamic tradition enlarge and enrich our understanding of these concepts? To find out, we must take a top-down approach. We must begin with God. Recall that God is one, but God has innumerable attributes expressed as names, divine names. When we consider the names and attributes of God that are mentioned in the Quran, we notice that they are different and dissimilar, even opposite. God is the life giver and also the slayer. God is the forgiver and also the avenger. God is the manifest and also the hidden. God is the majestic and also the beautiful. Despite the plurality and diversity of divine names and attributes, God remains one in every respect. There is no opposition or contradiction within God. Indeed, one of the divine names is As-Salam, the peace. This particular name tells us that no imperfection of any kind is to be found in God. There is nothing in God other than God that could possibly give rise to conflict, discord, or strife. Instead, there is absolute peace and perfect harmony. If God is characterized by absolute peace, what about God's creation? This brings us to the question of the nature of God's relationship to the world. One of the most sophisticated theological approaches to have appeared in the Islamic tradition teaches us that there are two distinct modes in which one might try to answer this question. These are known as incomparability and similarity. Both of these modes are rooted in the Quran, and both are valid and true simultaneously, which is why any exclusive reliance on any one of them leads to error and misguidance. Insofar as God is different and distinct from the created world, we must proclaim God's incomparability and distance and transcendence. But insofar as God's names and attributes are reflected or manifested in the created world, we must also declare God's similarity and nearness and immanence. The world cannot be characterized by absolute peace, because that attribute belongs only to God. On the other hand, the world cannot be characterized by absolute conflict either, because then the world would suffer from so much disorder that it wouldn't be able to survive, wouldn't be able to exist. Rather, the world displays a combination of both harmony and discord. It is characterized by a relative peace and relative conflict. Insofar as God is incomparable and transcendent, the world must be seen as full of disharmony, conflict, and discord. But insofar as God is also similar and immanent, the world must also be viewed as full of harmony, equilibrium, and peace. In God, all of the divine names and attributes coexist in absolute peace and perfect harmony. But when these names and attributes are reflected or manifested in the created world in an unimaginably wide range of diverse configurations, the result is sometimes harmony, equilibrium, and peace, and at other times, opposition, discord, conflict. Now we must move from theology to ethics. From the perspective of practical ethics, which of these is more desirable? Peace or conflict? Harmony or discord? The ultimate answer, of course, is that peace and harmony are more desirable because they represent divine qualities. When we move closer to God, we move towards peace and equilibrium. When we move away from God, we move towards conflict and discord. But then, there is an important plot twist in the story at this point. There's a critical aspect to the ethical question that becomes obvious as daylight when we reflect on the Quran. When it comes to human affairs, the Quran clearly favors peace and harmony over conflict and discord. However, the Quran does not do so either unconditionally or absolutely. This is because no ethical teaching is worth its name that does not take into account the actual forces operating in the world and the actual motivations, the actual tendencies that motivate people. Since conflict does exist in the world as a characteristic of the world and as a tendency in human beings, it has to be acknowledged and given its proper share, its proper due. Therefore, from the viewpoint of the Quran, peace, harmony, equilibrium, these are not always the best option. And engaging in conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, under certain circumstances, conflict is clearly preferable over peace. To live in the world as morally responsible human beings, we must know when is it best to choose peace and when should we engage in conflict. Given the theocentric nature of the Quranic discourse, this question is easy to answer, at least in theory. Our ultimate aim is to have peace with God, and this requires that we must submit ourselves to the moral will of God. However, when we try to submit ourselves to the moral will of God, we inevitably run into opposition, both from within and from without. And we find ourselves face to face with the forces and tendencies that oppose the moral will of God. At this point, we must make a choice. To be in a state of peace with God is to be in a state of conflict with anything or anyone that opposes the moral will of God. And to be in a state of peace with anything or anyone that opposes the moral will of God is to be in a state of conflict with God. Now, discerning the moral will of God is a tricky business, to say the least. And good, sincere, rational, and faithful people can have legitimate reasons for disagreeing among each other about the specifics of what God wants. Still, at least the followers of theistic religions can agree on some basic values. We can all agree, for example, that God prefers justice over and against oppression. The Islamic tradition tells us that one of the divine names is Al-Adl, which means the justice. God is not only just, God is justice itself. It follows that if we want to be in a state of peace with God, we have to establish peace with anything or anyone that promotes justice in the world. And simultaneously, we must not be in a state of harmony with anything or anyone that promotes injustice or oppression. In fact, we ought to be in a state of conflict with all such forces or tendencies. As Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. We cannot be in harmony with God while also being in harmony with forces and tendencies that oppose what God wants. Now, so far, all I have done is is present an outline of an Islamic understanding of harmony and discord, peace and conflict in the domains of theology and ethics. What I must do now is relate this understanding to the theme of interfaith harmony. I'd like to make only 2 points. First, I am not aware of anything in the Quran that prevents or prohibits any Muslim from cooperating with other people just because they happen to be non-Muslims. In fact, the Quranic imperative on this topic is simple and straightforward, and I quote, "Cooperate with each other in matters of virtue and piety, but do not cooperate with each other in matters of sin and transgression." End of quote. There is no requirement that Muslims must only cooperate with other Muslims. The main question to be settled is whether the purpose of any proposed cooperation has to do with promoting virtue and piety, or whether it has to do with promoting sin and transgression. The religious identities of the people involved in a venture that requires cooperation is much less important than the purpose for which they are cooperating. And this brings me to the second point. As I understand it, interfaith harmony refers to the idea and the project of establishing peaceful relations and promoting cooperation among different faith communities. Recall that from the viewpoint of practical ethics in Islam, there is nothing intrinsically good or bad about peace and conflict. It depends. It depends specifically on whether peace or conflict will allow us to submit to the moral will of God in a particular situation. The same is true of cooperation and non-cooperation. It depends. Therefore, at least from the viewpoint of practical ethics, and when viewed in and of itself, interfaith harmony is neither good nor bad. Personally, I think of promoting interfaith harmony as ringing a bell and calling people to come together. This is an essential first step, but it cannot possibly be the whole project. Because once people respond to the call, they would want to know the purpose for which they have been summoned. To me, at least, harmony for the sake of harmony is not all that interesting or exciting. What makes the idea and the project of interfaith harmony both interesting and exciting is the purpose that is to be served through it, and the extent to which that purpose helps us in achieving a state of peace with God. And that is the question that I find most deserving of our attention. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Afzaal. Thank you, Abdullah. We invite you back again for the rest of our week, tomorrow through Thursday. And with that, you are dismissed. I invite you to grab some coffee and some tea and some cookies on your way to class.